So there's been a movement in France fighting back against Macron and the establishment. Now, Macron is a centrist, and he's very pro the status quo. He kind of masks himself in this flowery rhetoric and, pays lip service to the people as if he's a real representative of them. But ultimately, he's an elitist. And even though he was very popular when he was elected not too long ago, now his approval rating has plummeted, and there's a strong coalition against him. This coalition includes the left and the right. So it includes, people who were who believed in Le Pen's philosophy, very right-wing philosophy, but elements of populism in there. And then also Mélenchon's, I know I'm mispronouncing that name, but bear with me, his leftist philosophy, who you could roughly describe him as France's Bernie Sanders, although many people would say that's not fair. They're probably right, but in the ballpark, further left because it's France, and France overall, in terms of the people, is further left than us here. But you have basically working people rising up and saying, we're not going to take your bullshit anymore. Now, Macron's approval rating has slipped to 26%. Dude, that's like George W. Bush after the Iraq War and the subprime mortgage crisis in the Great Recession territory. When Bush left office, I think his approval rating was about 26%. If I'm not mistaken, it was 29, which means right now, Macron is less popular than George W. Bush was at his least popular point. So let's watch this news report here. This is from Vice News on the protests, and then we'll talk about it. Macron démission!
The government says these were the most violent protests in Paris in over 50 years. On Saturday, 133 people were injured and more than 400 were arrested. The movement began 3 weeks ago on social media, with calls to protest attacks on fuel. But it's grown into a working-class revolt against the economic policies of President Emmanuel Macron. 27-year-old Jimmy Moreno came in from a nearby suburb. He works for the railways and voted for Macron.
C'est le peuple, tout bêtement, sans opinion politique. Nous sommes dans la rue tous par solidarité. La politique, notre politique, elle est corrompue.
The yellow vests that Jimmy and others are wearing have become a symbol. A law requires drivers to carry them, so they're easier to spot. Now, it's making their movements harder to ignore.
On retrouve une part d'humanité envers tout le monde. Tout le monde redevient humain. On est là pour une seule cause. Tout le monde met ses différends de côté.
Le peuple français.
Exactement. Nous sommes le peuple français, rien d'autre.
What's going on now? What are they chanting?
La démission de Macron, c'est ce qu'on souhaite. En premier, démission de Macron et changement de République pour être dans une vraie démocratie.
The taxes are designed to push drivers off the road to lower emissions. But people who can't afford to live in cities see it as a tax on the poor. Macron's Interior Ministry responded to the violence by deploying almost 70,000 officers, including 5,000 in Paris.
If the government thought that the extra security was going to calm protesters down, they were wrong. They've been here since 8 in the morning, and the police have been tear-gassing them all day.
By the afternoon, violent protesters were flipping cars and setting them on fire. In the centre of Paris, they smashed windows and attacked cafes and shops. Macron returned from the G20 in Argentina to take stock, but the government is preparing for more protests this weekend. You've had 3 weeks of protests now. People have died. There have been hundreds who've been injured and hundreds more who've been arrested. The government hasn't taken this seriously enough, have they?
The government had taken it very, very seriously, but it's not only just a citizen protest, it's also a very violent one because of some people from the far left and the far right we had on Saturday.
Away from the protests that were violent, there are still yellow vest protesters who say we represent the working and middle classes and we are the people that want to be listened to. Will you be responding to them?
Of course, and we are responding to them since the day we were elected.
But Macron has increased fuel tax, he's slashed wealth tax, he has loosened labour laws. How is that listening to the working and middle
Labour
classes?
laws is the way that you can get more and more people employed in France. But I think people listen to what they want to listen. I think people are able to listen to the changes that are implemented in their daily lives. But for taxes, they don't see the taxes that are decreasing, they just see the taxes that are increasing.
When the protests became too violent on Saturday, Jimmy left. He believes the police are too heavy-handed.
Voilà, c'est ça qu'ils nous ont envoyé. Elles ont été utilisées samedi 24 novembre. Donc les forces policières ont utilisé ça contre nous, contre le peuple.
Do you think that the scenes of violence that we've seen at the protests will undermine the credibility of the Yellow Vest movement?
Bien sûr que ça va nuire au mouvement, mais ça peut aussi le renforcer. Parce que le problème, c'est que justement, c'est toujours monsieur tout le monde qui est dans le mouvement des Gilets jaunes. Ceux qui y participent sont en train de voir la violence du gouvernement envers nous. Et justement, c'est en train d'attiser une violence en nous qu'on n'avait pas auparavant. Et donc, pour l'instant, ça ne va pas terminer. Pour l'instant, c'est pas forcément une révolution, mais ça sent le début d'une révolution.
So the protests worked. I mean, they scrapped that new gas tax increase. And this was an issue where you had the left and the right in France agree. It's basically a regressive tax. So it's a tax on the working poor who are, usually doing their own forms of transportation and driving themselves places. And the idea was, even if you think this is a way to address climate change, there are better ways to do it instead of a regressive tax on the poor. The overwhelming majority of the world's emissions come from corporations. It's not from regular folks. So you need to address it there. Don't go after the working poor in order to do it. So this was kind of like an alliance among working people on the left and the right against this. And again, it worked. They scrapped that gas tax as a result of these protests. These protests have been going on for a long time now. And the connecting thread between all of the people out there, if you talk to them, it's about corruption. It's about being anti-establishment because they think the establishment is screwing them. And it's basically about how the corporate neoliberal world order is leaving regular people behind. And that needs to be addressed. So it reminded me of this great quote from a Michael Moore movie from a long time ago, where he said, or somebody said in the movie, in the United States, the people are scared of the government. In France, the government is scared of the people. And here you see a great example of that. They caved when they were like, holy shit, what is going on here? We need to quell these protests somehow. And so they got rid of that tax increase. So absolutely fascinating. And listen, it's one of those unspeakable, politically incorrect truths that sometimes violent protests actually end up achieving their goals. Again, you're not allowed to say that, and it's an uncomfortable reality, but oftentimes that does happen. Now, I'm of the belief that you actually could achieve the same things without the violence, because if you do a general strike and almost everybody in the country, or the majority of the country, all agrees, like, yeah, we're going to do a general strike now, and we peacefully protest, the economy grinds to a halt. And when the economy grinds to a halt, that means that you're costing the so-called captains of industry a hell of a lot of money. So they're going to take notice, and they're going to say, oh, fuck, we're losing a shitload of cash now, so what do you guys want? So I'm of the belief that if you do a general strike and you actually stick to the principles of nonviolent resistance, not only do you have the moral high ground and the ethical high ground, but you also could get the same results. So that's my belief, and I would have done that. But at the same time that, that would work, it also just happens to be true, and this is evidence of it here, that those protests got out of control, and they kind of worked. So that doesn't mean go out there and start burning cars and because also you're creating more victims when you do that. And the person who owned that car didn't do anything wrong. And even if you go and you try to, do damage to government property, well, then our tax dollars are going to have to fix it anyway. So we're going to pay for it eventually anyway. So I have a principled stance against violence when it comes to these protests and stuff. But having said that, it also is just true that in this case it ended up working. So we'll see what happens moving forward. I wonder if there will be, a coalition on other issues. But honestly, I think it's time in this country for a general strike. And we need to have a clear agenda and be very specific with what we're asking for when we do that general strike. There's one thing that really pisses me off about protests, and that's usually that even the organized ones are unorganized in the sense that it's just this vague, amorphous expression of rage and is never super specific. But you could actually get a lot more accomplished when it's super specific. You need strong leadership for these protests. When it came to the civil rights movement, you had really strong leaders who were crystal clear about what they were asking for in those protests. So for us to do it this time, I think we should be crystal clear. I think we should talk about Medicare for all. That should be a demand. I think a living wage should be a demand. I think ending the wars should be a demand. I think money out of politics should be a demand. I think a Green New Deal should be a demand. I think, honestly, and this one is going to be last on the list because I'm the only fucking person talking about it, but having a national direct ballot initiative system should be a demand where every time we have an election, a federal election, we get to vote on the 5 most important issues directly and Congress has to implement it and it becomes law of the land. So I think we should have a general protest, and I think it should be very organized and specific and nonviolent, to be clear. But what's happening in France is fascinating. It's also fascinating how fast Macron's approval rating dropped. And all of those hot takes from establishment pundits in the U.S. talking about how the U.S. needs its own Macron, those takes look as mind-numbingly stupid as we thought they were at the time.